If you look on your study guide for lesson 4 and actually go to what would be, for those that just have tonight's lesson, would be the second page or page 20. You'll see page numbers at the very bottom because we've already covered the first page. And the first page and what we did last week is we're dealing with the enduring Word of God, the eternal nature of God's Word. And we looked at several passages in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, but the idea that life, this earth, things here will pass away, but the Word of God has this enduring, eternal quality. Even as Jesus said, heaven and earth will pass away, but my Word will never pass away. It's going to abide forever. And so, in looking at the enduring Word of God, we then have been on this journey that covers several bases of inspiration, trying to determine if indeed, or how we can determine if indeed the Bible is inspired, as it says of itself that it is. And that takes us then to evidences. And we've already been looking, and shall look at some more evidences, but archaeological evidences. We've looked at scientific, pre-scientific evidences. We've looked at prophetic evidences, messianic prophecies. Tim, when I was gone here about a month ago or so, took this class through and looked at that fascinating history with Jericho and the walls of Jericho. So as we're looking at history, archaeology, science, pre-scientific knowledge, these are all evidences. But now what we're wanting to do is to look at the biblical text itself, which takes us back again to archaeology, but also to look at the amount of biblical literature that we have. Now, this outline kind of gives an introduction to an idea that's going to be covered later in the outline and as the class progresses. And it's making an assumption here that I just want to define very quickly, but they're on page 20, and what would be that second paragraph where it says, if the Bible has over 20 or 200,000 scribal errors and just the New Testament cannot be reliable, some have made suggestion of these large numbers of scribal errors. This may seem like a staggering figure to the uninformed mind, although one may hear of thousands of variants of errors or errors. This is based on counting the same error in each of the 5,000 manuscripts. We have over 5,300 manuscripts of the New Testament material alone. So if you find that in a lot of those manuscripts that there were some scribal variants, and I'm going to be illustrating, I don't know if I'll get to those tonight, but if not tonight, next week for sure, that if that is repeated all those times, well then it's one mistake. As far as a scribal error, it could be simply a transposition. How many of you have ever in your own word processing or writing, but especially word processing, that you transpose your letters? We do it all the time. And we even do that when we text. We do it in a lot of different situations. Yeah, and Hoyt speaks into his phone a lot. He just rarely proofreads. But which can be embarrassing at times, but and that's another issue. But the point is that there would be a situation where if there was a scribal error of a transposition, and those that were scribes through the first couple hundred centuries of the writing down or the copying of the biblical text, and they're just writing away, many times some of those transpositions were just repeated. Now, did it change the word? On some very rare occasions it did, but normally it doesn't. If you're reading along and you read a C word and it's spelled R-E-C-I-E-V-E-D, you're going to say, what's that word? Receive. But did I spell it correctly? No, because we all know that I before E except after C, usually. And we will even make that mistake occasionally, but you'll see it. But you have to understand that a lot of the errors of the variants that they're talking about are variants of transpositions and sometimes even a difficult or a mistake in reference to numbers. We'll be talking about that later too. Tim dealt with that in either 1st or 2nd Samuel, I can't remember, not too many months ago. But a variant in some of our translations, in some translations it was 70, in some translations it was 700. You remember that? And because, again, depending on the text that was used, there was a variant which probably takes us back again to a textual consideration and trying to find the older, the reliable, or which text seems to have this majority. And there again we have a difference sometimes, especially this is true in the New Testament, between the received text, called the Textus Receptus, of which was depended upon for a number of centuries, that produced many of the first English Bibles, including the King James Version and even the American Standard Version of 1901. And also that understand that the New King James Version continued to use the received text. Somebody was reading in their Bible the other day, I was having a class, and they said, and there was a marginal reading, and it said NU. And they said, what is this NU? The N stands for Nestle-Aland, which is the Westcott and Hort text, based upon older, more reliable text in most cases. The U stands for the United Bible Societies, and which is an apologetic for the newer text, even including today's English version, the TEV. But that which is referred to as the Nestle-Aland text does have some slight variations from time to time from the received text. Nothing critical or massive enough for us to be alarmed by virtue of some kind of, doctrinal difference or change. So I always find it interesting when people say, oh, we've read that there are thousands of errors, and many times these are simply scribal variants. And I'm going to be giving all kinds of examples of them later on. But the material inserted this section right here before we get into this whole idea of the criteria that we've got to use. The next paragraph says, after careful examination, they have found that only 40 lines, about 400 words, of the 20,000 lines are in question. Now, did you get that? That only 40 lines, about 400 words, of the 20,000 lines are in question. We can be sure that the New Testament is 99.5% pure. That, in other words, from what we have, from the oldest, most reliable manuscripts, codices, texts that we have, is that we have such a massive number of them, that we're able to do a wonderful job of checks and balances to determine if a text belongs in the Scripture, or its syntax, its word order, or translation into other languages. The Iliad that supposedly has been written by Homer, by contrast, has 5% corrupted text. We're going to see later on that the only copies that we have are hundreds of years separated from when? Hundreds of years separated when Homer had written them to begin with. But when you look at that, there is no ancient text that is more reliable than the New Testament. You see, when you talk about 400 words of 20,000 lines that are in question, that's 1/2, 95.5%. That's 1/2 of 1%, as opposed to 5% corruption of Homer's work in the Iliad. What is more helpful is that we know exactly the differences of the Greek, what the Greek text are. At the foot of each page of the Greek text, one can see the footnotes which document which variants that particular verse might have. Also noted is which manuscripts support which variant, and in this way lower criticism has dispelled, and lower criticism, remember that's textual criticism, that has dispelled fears of an unreliable text. And that brings us to this chart, which I just rushedly had done last week as we had run out of time. But in the reliability of the Bible, the bibliographical and internal criteria, by means of this criteria, the historical reliability of the Bible should be tested by the same criteria that all historical documents are tested. Examining these three factors. Number one, the number of existing manuscripts or codices. So I don't care if we're talking about biblical literature, if we're talking about Homer, if we're talking about Plato, if we're talking about Pliny, if we're talking about Aristotle, if we're talking about whomever it might be, even the writings of Julius Caesar, because there are many. Or later on, if we're talking about the writings as we brought out as an example last week of William Shakespeare, that the number of existing manuscripts or codices become important. How many are there? Number two, that in textual criticism, we deal with dating and the authorship of those manuscripts and trying to solidify the date and who the author is. And we understand that there are a few books in the Bible that it's difficult to determine authorship, for example. Who can give a couple of books where it's somewhat difficult to determine the authorship of a book? What's your name? Annette?
Yeah. Hebrews.
Yeah, the book of Hebrews. And while there's many people that may believe that it's Paul, but we just don't. It's not like in all of the other epistles of Paul, he says, I, Paul, the servant of Jesus Christ. And so Hebrews has been one of those. What's another book? What's an Old Testament book where there's been some question as to authorship, even amongst conservative scholarship? I'm sorry? Yeah, the book of Job. Again, many believe that Moses could have very well written it, but we just don't know for sure. So this comes into factor that when you want to look at this text and try to determine the various criteria, let alone when it comes to dating. And it very much appears that Job would have lived during what period of time? Patriarchal age, it very much appears to be, but these become critical factors. Number three, then, what we just touched upon, analysis of variant readings found within the manuscript's extant. And so what's available to us? And are there variances? Are there variants that are found? And yes, there are. Now, having said that, what I want us to do is I want to go through, and I'm going to do this kind of fast, but I want to give, just as an example, and I chose just a few of these, but some of the existing Old Testament manuscripts that we have, and show some pictures of them too, because we're going to be seeing that when it comes to biblical literature, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, understand that we have, as it were, volumes of manuscripts and copies, and not to mention fragments. Of the New Testament alone, 53, we're going to talk about that in a little while. I want to talk about Old Testament, but of the New Testament alone, over 5,300 copies of manuscripts, but over 10,000 fragments. Okay? But even in the Old Testament, the silver scrolls, and when we look at this is a very interesting one. I wanted to give you an example of what was found here, some photographs. While excavating a burial tomb near Jerusalem in 1979, Gabriel Barkey uncovered the oldest known copy of an Old Testament scripture. It's right here. Not discovered until 1979. It's the priestly blessing that's found in Numbers chapter 6, verses 24 through 26. And it was discovered on two small silver scrolls dated the 7th century BC, placing it as literature older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. So understand, the Dead Sea Scrolls are around 2,100 years old. But 7th century BC then even predates by 400 years and older. It was a marvelous, and you can kind of tell on the left, because what they've done is that's an actual photo of the silver scroll, and then what they've done is they've taken this almost silhouette type of form, but then they're able to depict, the Hebraists were able then to determine there as you have Hebrew written. The silver scroll. This was a discovery of utmost importance. And Barkey, by the way, is professor of archaeology at the Bar Ilan University near Tel Aviv. And these verses predate, again, the famous Dead Sea Scrolls by approximately 4 centuries. They're the only biblical verses we have from the time of what's known as the First Temple period. This is an amazing discovery. Now, not fine to 1979. Did it properly represent what basically we'd had in the Bible in the book of Numbers for all those years? Yes. And so that becomes very huge for authentication as well of the biblical literature. When we go to the next one, the Dead Sea Scrolls, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we're going to be dealing with major sections dealing with the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, also known as the Qumran Caves, and there are 11 of them, I do believe this is cave number 4. And cave number 4, I will say this, that while the 11 caves had within them just all kinds of scrolls, and many of them in earthen vessels like these clay jars, and some fully intact, some broken, some scrolls fully intact, some in fragments. But in cave 4, 90% of the biblical literature was all found in cave 4. Now, they also had things, they literally had business meeting records, just like, you know, when you take notes for our meetings, right? If it was among the Essenes, is they wrote down this literature. They found shopping lists. Okay? So they found all different kinds of literature, but was great importance. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were first discovered in 1947 by a Bedouin shepherd. And the story goes that his son, while they're tending their sheep, going through this little valley, as you can see in Qumran, and you see where the cave is there. I don't know if it was this particular cave, but the son was taking rocks and seeing if he could pitch the rocks into the cave. He was making a little game of it while his dad was tending the sheep. Well, one of the times he threw a rock and he heard something clink, that it hit something that wasn't just the side of the cave, it wasn't just dirt. That got the attention, scaled the side of the cliff, went into it, and found amazing amount of these clay pots with all these bits of literature and pieces. And by the way, in 1947, when it comes to the book of Isaiah, not one, but 2 complete scrolls of Isaiah were found. And we had those in San Diego just not too long ago, not too many years ago. We went down and saw the Dead Sea Scrolls. The first time they were on American soil was in San Diego about, I don't know how many years ago that was, babe, but it was fascinating. This Hebrew and Aramaic literature. I have a whole lot more to say about that, but so much of the Hebrew biblical canon now it can very much depend upon an authenticity of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because again, that they found that with these that were 2,100 years old and up to that time, our Old Testament had been written and been dependent upon manuscripts that were much younger. They thought for sure they were going to find discrepancies, and they found virtually no discrepancies. It's just amazing. We go back, and you all understand that what is the Septuagint? The Septuagint is what? Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. And originally had actually even been commissioned by whom? Alexander the Great. But in the years that was produced, the Septuagint, and also found in 2 codices, the Vaticanus and the Sinaiticus. There are 3 major manuscripts that we'll be talking about. These 2, indeed, the Vaticanus and the Sinaiticus, but also the Alexandrinus. But the Septuagint, also found in these codices. And why is it called the Septuagint? Yeah, because the 70 scholars that were scholarly in the biblical languages. And then what's the abbreviation for the Septuagint then? LXX, Roman numeral 70. So you'll find in literature all the time, it'll say the LXX, which is referring to the Septuagint. Yeah, the Septuagint sometimes is called the Greek Old Testament simply, but it's the earliest extant Koine Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. And it is estimated that the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, known as the Torah, or Pentateuch, were translated in the mid-3rd century BC, and the remaining texts were translated in the 2nd century BC. And so it just becomes this very, very valuable. And by the way, who quoted frequently from the Septuagint version of the Bible? Jesus himself did. and who wrote and quoted in their writings frequently from the Septuagint? The New Testament writers, and particularly the Apostle Paul. Now, sometimes they quoted directly from an Aramaic Old Testament, but have you ever noticed that you'll be reading a New Testament prophecy, an Old Testament prophecy recorded in the New Testament, for Isaiah has said, and the prophecy is there in one of the writings of Paul, for example. And then you go back to where it came from in Isaiah, and you think, I see it, but it just seems different in the Old Testament, in the book of Isaiah, than what Paul has written over here in Corinthians, for example. Why would that be? Our Old Testament has been translated, for most of our English Bibles, our Old Testament has been translated from what? From a Hebrew text. Not from the Septuagint. But syntactically, you'll have these variations. It's the same stuff and it's the same material, but the reason why it reads differently many times is the difference between a translating from Hebrew to English as opposed to translating from Greek, because you had two steps. You went from Hebrew to Greek to English. Now, just suppose we take the three Barkuses, and obviously we'll have Tim speak Greek because his name is Barkus, for crying out loud. And Ellen does speak pretty good Spanish. And Zach, you looked out, you're English. But can you imagine that if Tim spoke something in Greek, and Ellen understands that, and then she goes ahead and says the same thing in Spanish, but now she says it to Zach because you understand Spanish, and now he's going to write it down in English. Do you think that there's going to be some syntactical challenges going from Hebrew to Greek to English? Yes. And many times that's the simple explanation to why doesn't it look quite the same? But fantastic study in reference to the Septuagint. Move along. How many of you have heard of the Peshitta? The Syriac version of Syria. Early 5th century A.D. And in this, of the Syriac, the Peshitta, it's a standard version of the Bible for the churches of Syriac tradition of Syria. And the consensus within biblical scholarship, and though it's maybe not universal, but the consensus is that the Old Testament of the Peshitta was translated into Syriac from Hebrew probably about the 2nd century A.D. So we're talking about the Old Testament, but the Hebrew to Syriac in the 2nd century A.D. So right after, certainly after the apostolic age is over, the apostles are dead. And that the New Testament of the Peshitta was translated from Greek during that period of time. And the New Testament originally excluded disputed books. The Peshitta excluded 2 Peter, 2 John, 3 John, Jude, and Revelation. But it had become a standard for the Syriac churches by the 5th century A.D. All right. But the 5 books were added to what is known as the Harclean version in 616 A.D. And it's called that because Thomas Harquell is the one that finally said that these are legitimate, these books. But in 1905, the UBS, the United Bible Society, the Peshitta used new editions prepared by a Syriacist fellow that studies the Syriac language by the name of John Gwynn from Ireland for the missing books. It's a fascinating history, but very, very important documents as well. The Vulgate. Everybody's here at the Vulgate, right? The Latin Vulgate, which is also referred to as Codex Amiatinas. And who is responsible for, do I have that written down? I do not. 8th century you have the development, but originally in the 5th century, who is responsible for the development of the Vulgate? What was his name? What's that? No. Who said it? Jerome. Very good. Jerome. Of the Roman Church indeed, but of the 5th century, no pope, because the first pope was not until 606. But was there the development of the apostasy, and were there bishops And was there a bishop of Rome? Indeed there was, but just not identified as a pope. I just want to clear that up because it would be an anachronism to suggest that a pope would be involved because there were no popes yet. Does that make sense to everybody? So, the Vulgate is very important, late 4th century, this Latin translation, and that's the thing, that it was translated into Latin. And it was to become in time the Catholic Church's official, what they call the promulgated Latin version of the Bible. And it is still used fundamentally in the Latin Church and Latin Masses today. And again, largely the work of Jerome, who in 382 had been commissioned by the bishop of Rome. At the time, it was a man by the name of Damasus. Now, the Catholic Church will tell you he was the Pope, but he was the bishop of Rome, to revise the Old Latin. And so there's a lot of valuable history about the Vulgate as well. But there was a lot of dependence upon the Latin Vulgate for many, many, many years, even into some of the early translations of the English Bible. A lot of these things we're going to have more to say about as we go on. I'm trying to just show, and there, by the way, there's the Vulgate, and there's a snapshot of Jerome. I thought, that's pretty good for back in that day, but anyway, but there's a photographic copy of the Vulgate of that particular codex. The Masoretic text. Who has heard of the Masoretic text? Very, very important. The Masoretic text is the authoritative Hebrew and Aramaic text. Of the 24 books of the Tanakh, which is simply Hebrew for in rabbinic Judaism, but for the law, the Torah, but for the Old Testament. Now, why 24 books? How many books are in the Old Testament? 39. They have the same Bible we do, but it says 24. Why is it? I'm sorry, Ellen, got to speak up. Yes, they are. For example, Samuel and the Kings and the Chronicles, rather than having those 6 books, you have 2 sections. There's the clumping of some of the prophets. And so the material is there, but the order and the numbering of the Hebrew Bible that even Jews would use today is different than us, although the material is there. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody? But the Masoretic text also, and what is very well known, the Aleppo and Leningrad Codex. But this was primarily copied, edited, and distributed by a group of Jews known as the Masoretes between the 7th and 10th centuries A.D. I have the 10th century, I think, down there, but really even earlier on in the Masoretic text, there were appearances of parts of it as in the late 600s. The oldest extant manuscript dated from what we have available to us in the 9th century, the Aleppo Codex, once the oldest known complete copy, but since 1947, we have more of that because of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But for a long, long time, until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that was the oldest text. But the Masoretic text defines the Jewish canon and its precise letter text with its, by the way, vocalization and accentuation known as the Masor. Okay, now I got to say this because you all know that I love the Hebrew language, and the thing that we know about the Hebrew language is what kind of a language is a Hebrew language. When it comes to vowels and consonants, what is the Hebrew language? It's consonantal. The Hebrew alphabet, there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. It has no vowels. 22 consonants. I've picked up Hebrew newspapers before, and in going through and trying to read the Hebrew newspaper, there are no vowel points. It was the Masoretes that came up with the vowel pointing system in again, the 7th century. It was by their tradition that how words were pronounced and how the inflections were pronounced. But what the Masoretes did, we have a great deal of thanks to them, because it can take people like us that want to try to learn the Hebrew language that are non-Hebrew people, non-Hebrew speaking people. They gave a vowel pointing system. And if you look now in a Hebrew interlinear, that's where you'll see those little lines and dots above and below and within the Hebrew alphabet, from the Aleph to the Tau. the Masoretic text is very, very valuable for many reasons, including the vocalization of the Hebrew language. Some of you probably have heard, oh, by the way, the Nash Papyrus. And Nash was very well known from some of his discoveries and discovering this papyrus. And in the 2nd century BC, this piece is, that's old, contains a portion of a pre-Masoretic text they would use, but specifically the 10 Commandments found here and the Shema Israel. Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one. Lord, Jehovah, God is one God. And that's called the Shema in Hebrew. The verb Shema means to listen, to hear. Hear, O Israel. And so in this 2nd century papyrus is found the 10 Commandments and Deuteronomy 6. So probably taken from Deuteronomy 5, because remember we have the 10 Commandments listed twice. In Exodus 5, Exodus 20 rather, Exodus 20, and then Deuteronomy 5. Because why is it called the book of Deuteronomy? The second giving of the law, which is Greek, not Hebrew. Deuteros, number 2, nomos, law, second law. The most Genesis is Greek. Exodus is Greek. Those are basically Greek type of words, a lot of those are. And it's the second giving of the law. And so, no doubt, then when you would go from Deuteronomy 5 right into Deuteronomy 6, where the Shema was found. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. The Samaritan Pentateuch from 200 to 100 BC as the time works down. Again, sorry about the blur of that. But in the Samaritan Pentateuch, also known as the Samaritan Torah, the Hebrew giving of the law, is a text of the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy. It's written in the Samaritan alphabet, another old Semitic type of language, and used as scripture by the Samaritans, and it constitutes what they refer to as their entire biblical canon. But there are a lot of variations and differences from some of the Samaritan Pentateuch as opposed to some of the older copies of the Pentateuch that have been found. But again, great value. And the fact is some of the variations that are found agree not with the Hebrew text, but agree more with the Septuagint. Very interesting. That's a subject in and of itself. But it did not, this first became known to the Western world in 1631. In 1631. Very old. Then we have the Targum. And maybe some of you have heard of the Targum before. These are Aramaic texts, originally spoken translations. They were spoken translations of the Jewish scriptures, again called the Tanakh. And that a professional interpreter, a meturgaman, he would be one that would he'd be the one that interpreted, would read these out loud. But the listeners would listen, but in the common language of wherever they were. But it had become necessary near the end of the 1st century BC, as the common language was Aramaic. Does everybody understand that really in the days of Jesus and the early disciples, they weren't really in most cases speaking Hebrew, they were much more speaking Aramaic. But what do we know about Hebrew and Aramaic? One, they share the same what? Alphabet, and 2, they share very similar vocabulary. And it's not a perfect illustration, but I use this illustration. There's a couple of things. It's kind of like, is there a difference between Portuguese and Spanish? Yes, there is. Would there be a lot of similarities? Yes, there would be. Is there a difference between the Swiss-Italian dialect that my mother-in-law speaks, Ticinese, if she were to go down into Italy and speak the Italian? She could probably get by, but even when she went back for the first time in 1973, something like that, I think it was, Mom. But she had been taught the Ticinese since she was a little girl in the late 1800s. No, not quite. But it woke up some of you. But anyway, But when she had been taught that language that her folks brought over to this country in 1922, and she goes back in 1973, and we've got some generations that have passed by, and she's speaking the Techanesan, and some of the old people said, what? Oh, you speak the old language. Now, could you understand? Yes, you could. But see, this is a very interesting thing, and so they're speaking Aramaic, which is very much like, in fact, in most lexicons of the Hebrew language will be sections dealing with Aramaic. Then finally, how are we doing here? Of an example of the Targum right there, by the way. And finally, Coptic. And anytime you talk about like Coptic, even today, if they talk about Coptic Christians, those are Christians living where? And of what race? Egyptian. Okay? And the Coptic, the 3rd or 4th century A.D., again, very, very interesting text. There have been many Coptic versions of the Bible, that is, so put into Egyptian language from many years ago, and some of the earliest. But several versions were made in the ancient world with different editions of both the Old and the New Testament. In all 4 of the major dialects, because the Coptics, these Egyptians, have 4 major dialects, and I don't even pretend to know any Egyptian at all, but the Bohairic, I would say, the Fayumic, the Sahidic, I would say, because that's how a Hebrew would say it, and the Hamimic, but they had those that were translated into Coptic, and many very, very, very old. Now, here's the point that I want to make in going over all of this. Is we'll come back to that. In fact, what I want to just go to real quick, because what we're going to be we're going to be doing 2 things next week, because you just rang the bell, did you not? Okay, good. We got a little bit of time. I'll come back. Here's the thing. In fact, going back to this one, let me hit this backspace, go back to this one. And the New Testament is from the Old Testament. But I just want to give a comparison again. 5,300 plus Greek manuscripts, 10,000 plus Latin manuscripts, 9,300 manuscripts in other languages, Syriac, Slavic, Ethiopic, Coptic, and Armenian. The papyri, the uncials, the cursives, the minuscules, and the lectionaries, which we're all going to define later, ranging from 125 AD to the 15th century, when you're talking about the bulk. The Muratorian fragment, which I've got a lot of material I want to share with you about that, because that is the oldest known collection of the New Testament books by at least 170 AD. Then what are known as the patristics, the early church fathers in the 2nd and 4th century AD. What I want you to see is look at the abundance, even just of the New Testament, look at the abundance of copies of manuscripts, codices, and fragments that we have. Now, when you wrap your head around that, and this is just the New Testament, I just gave you a little sample of some very ancient Old Testament things, historically valuable, right? Now, what we're going to do next week, we'll spend more time because we got to close. So when we look at the New Testament, for example, the New Testament was written somewhere between 48 and 100 AD, conservatively. Earliest known copies of anything from the New Testament would be, of anything, I'm not talking about the complete collection of all the books, but of early writings that we have extant of 125 AD. A 25-year span of time that when you're thinking about and discovering these, and again with 5,300 plus copies. Now, those are interesting numbers because look at the date 48 to 100 is when it was actually the original autographs were written at that time. And then something is found in 125, and the next 25 years there's a proliferation of finding of many texts. Do you see how close that is to the original? Now compare that to Homer, who has written in approximately 900 BC. The earliest copy that we have is dated around 400 BC, a span of 500 years, and of all of his work, 643 copies. As compared to 5,300 of Tacitus, Roman senator and author, 100 AD. The earliest copy of Tacitus' work we have is 1100 AD. 1,000 years, and only 20 copies. Livy, I've got written down who all these guys are. Tacitus, as I said, Roman senator. Livy is a Roman historian. 59 BC, died in 17 AD. Earliest known writing is 300 AD, 300 years, 20 copies. And what we're going to do is we're going to see that some of these are amazing You go down to Euripides, and Euripides, what did that guy do? He was an Athenian playwright, living somewhere from about 480 to 406 BC. But the earliest, the most current, the copy that we have, 1100 AD. That's a span of 1500 years. Now, as those spans increase like that, what do you suppose we would call into question? What's that? Validity, authenticity, accuracy, and so forth. You don't have that problem. And I've got another page of these as well that you can see it in fellows that we are. Suetonius, a very well-known politician, Roman historian, and you look at his, even of Aristotle, from 384 to 322 BC, earliest 1100 AD, 1400 years, and only 5 copies of his work. When you match that up against the biblical literature in the manuscripts, the codices, and the fragments, the biblical literature blows everything out of the water of what's extant and what's available. Okay, we're going to stop, right? We've got to stop. You already rang the bell, did you not? Yeah. We'll have a lot more to say about that. This information, I believe that as we look at this, is why we can have great confidence in the biblical literature. And I just hope that you'll continue to be interested in working through this, because we've got a whole lot more work, a whole lot more photographs, a whole lot more stuff to do. David, last word.
Have the manuscripts been moved over so they're available online now?
Oh, absolutely. Manuscripts, most of the manuscripts are very available online. Online. You can go see pictures of them and so forth. And if you're willing to do a little bit of traveling to the British Museum, to the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, and into the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, it's amazing what you can go put your eyeballs on. And so what's available to look at that, and including the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, one of the most exciting things ever is to see the Isaiah scroll, to see the commentary on Habakkuk and so forth, and these things that are over 2,100 years old, and to look at the style and the printing. It's just amazing. We got to stop. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. But we got to quit. Okay.